Hello, good morning. Today, our guest is the esteemed Ron Hunt. Hello, Ron. How are you doing?
Fine, fine.
I am great. So, Ron, today we're going to be talking about COVID-19. What is COVID-19, Ron?
Well, obviously, it's the epidemic that was caused by a virus that first appeared in the city of Wuhan late in 2019.
Great. Who is Jeffrey Sachs and why is he relevant in the COVID-19 debate?
Well, I mean, Jeffrey Sachs is a very high-ranking international academic. He actually a very impressive record. In other words, he ended up getting tenure at Harvard University at the age of 28, probably the youngest tenured professor in the history of Harvard. And he's held a wide range of other very impressive international positions over the last 20 or 30 years. He's an economist by training, but has also moved into various other areas of public policy. And then at the beginning of the COVID epidemic, because of his international stature, he was selected by the Lancet, a leading international medical journal, to be the chairman of the Lancet Commission that they established. In other words, an international body composed of many very high-ranking and prestigious individuals, mostly academics and medical professionals and scientific figures from around the world to investigate all aspects of the COVID epidemic, given the tremendously important nature of that epidemic.
Great, Ron. I read your article, Jeffrey Sachs as a righteous rogue. Ron, I know you have brilliant information on Jeffrey Sachs. You have been covering this story for some time. So just expound. Tell us all that you know. Why was Jeffrey Sachs essentially canceled? What did he do? What did his commission reveal?
Well, I'm not sure if you could really say he was canceled in any way. Obviously, he's come under a great deal of criticism. He served as chairman of as the Lancet's COVID Commission. In other words, investigating all aspects of the COVID epidemic that has, killed probably close to 20 million people worldwide. Dramatic event. And then as there were a number of separate bodies in that organization that he established to look at different aspects of the epidemic, the economic implications, the origins of the virus, means of minimizing the damage and death worldwide, all sorts of things like that. And then as time went by, he became more and more suspicious that the individuals he had appointed to investigate the origins of the virus were not being candid with it. In other words, there seemed to be a concerted effort by many of those scientists associated with the American government to conceal the true origins of the virus. And the most significant issue from the beginning has been where the virus came from. There have been largely two theories proposed. Uh, One of them is simply that the virus appeared naturally, a random mutation in some bat or other form of animal life that then spread into the human body during late 2019 in the city of Wuhan, China. In other words, that's basically been associated with the possibility of the virus having spread from what was called the wet market, in other words, an animal market in the city of Wuhan. The other possibility, which was taken very seriously early on by some of the leading figures investigating the issue, was that the virus came from a human laboratory. The virus was bioengineered. The virus was not natural, but was artificial in origin. And in fact, early on, when some of the leading virologists looked at the nature of the virus, its genetic structure, they saw some extremely suspicious elements. In other words, there were certain parts of the virus that seemed not the sort of thing that would have appeared in a natural virus that came from an animal species, but more would have been put in a laboratory. Now, those rumors began very early on. In other words, there were widespread claims made that the virus had leaked from a laboratory because it turns out the most advanced virology laboratory in China is located in the city of Wuhan. It's the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And so a number of people said, just fairly naturally, that if a mysterious virus that has strange, apparently artificial characteristics suddenly appeared in the one city in China that has China's most advanced virology lab, it's probably more than coincidental. And so there were rumors like that spread very widely across social media, and especially from anti-China groups in the West as early as January. In other words, mid to late January, it was rampant across the internet. And so what ended up happening then is that much of the scientific establishment in February and March took a very strong position on the other side. There were a couple of papers published, one of them in Science, one of them in Nature Health, co-signed by a long list of very reputable international scientists, saying that there's absolutely no evidence that the COVID virus was artificial, and therefore arguing that this was a, quote, conspiracy theory that should be ignored and stamped down. And that was pretty much Jeffrey Sachs's view. In other words, he basically had read the same articles, had read the same media coverage, and assumed that the virus was natural. But then when he started asking questions of the virologist he had appointed to his panel to investigate the origins, he became very suspicious that they were not being candid with him, that they were being deceitful, that they were covering up the true facts. And as he ended up talking with additional experts and looking at the facts and educating himself in issues of virology, he concluded that there was strong, perhaps even overwhelming evidence that the virus came from a laboratory, and in particular, that it was based on American biotechnology, American bioengineering. Now, it turns out America had a relationship with the Wuhan lab. In other words, an organization called the EcoHealth Alliance, whose head Sachs had actually appointed to run the section of his committee dealing with the origins of the virus, a man named Peter Daszak. It ended up taking a great deal of funding over the years from the Pentagon and from other national security elements of the American state, and had given small portions of that money to fund viral research in the Wuhan lab. And so Peter Daszak was one of the key figures who made tremendous efforts to persuade everybody that the virus was entirely natural and had no artificial origins. And some people started, arguing very, obviously, that if Daszak had been involved in funding the viral research at the Wuhan lab, and if there was any chance that viral research had led to an epidemic that had killed over 1 million Americans and 15 million people or 20 million people worldwide, Daszak, his organization, and all the other virologists who'd been involved in that type of research could come under enormous heavily criticism. And that was the reason they had a vested interest in covering up the true origins of the virus and pretending that it was natural, when there was actually very considerable evidence that it wasn't.
Brilliant, Ron. So, Ron, there is a distinguished academic and professional called Robert Redfield, and Robert Redfield has also endorsed the possibility that COVID might have leaked from a lab. Robert Redfield was once the head of the CDC. The FBI, according to the New York Times, has given credibility to this idea. So it is no longer a conspiracy. And furthermore, there is an article published in PNAS by somebody called Robert F. Gary titled, "The Evidence Remains Clear. SARS-CoV-2 emerged via the wildlife trade." I have read some of the article. I have not read all of it, but based on what I've seen so far, this person has failed to disprove his critics. And I looked at the comments, and the commenters, they also agree that Professor Gary has not rebuked the argument that COVID-19 might have leaked from a lab. I looked at the section titled Wildlife Origins, and it is not particularly impressive. I'm just saying this because on this show we like to give opposing opinions.
Sure. I mean, the whole thing is there's been a sharp division within the virology community, with virology experts on both sides of it. The division is between the virus being natural or the virus being artificial. And in fact, the man you mentioned, Gary, has certainly been one of the figures involved, but there are many other even more prominent figures, with probably Christine Anderson being one of the most visible on it, arguing for the natural origin. In fact, I believe there have probably been, I think it was probably about 30 or 40 scientific experts, including virologists, who signed those original papers in Nature, Health, and Science arguing for natural origin. Now, the whole thing about it is the two possibilities proposed have been a natural origin and a lab leak. In other words, did the virus randomly come from the Wuhan animal wildlife market, or did it leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology? And in fact, about a year ago, some very detailed papers came out strongly arguing that the initial spread of the virus actually was from the wildlife market. In other words, there's simply the whole point is when you look at, for example, the evidence of the early cases of the virus, people being infected with it in the city of Wuhan, there's virtually no geographical connection with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In other words, if the virus had leaked from that laboratory, you would expect at least some of the early cases to have some geographical connection with the laboratory from which it leaked. I mean, Wuhan is a very large city. It's much larger than New York City. It has a population of 11 million. All the early cases appeared on the opposite side of the city from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And that's probably the strongest evidence against any lab leak. In other words, a random lab leak you would expect to have produced infections in the geographical vicinity of the place where it leaked. And that's simply not the case. Now, again, all of these scientific issues have been debated very strongly back and forth. And there are questions of, for example, the methodology involved, all sorts of issues like that. But overall, there's simply no evidence for any lab leak at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There's another very interesting case. A professional virologist, an Australian professional virologist named Danielle Anderson, was working at the Wuhan lab during the period in question. She basically was there. She was simply there on exchange fellowship. She's the single most credible Western eyewitness to what happened. And she says there's simply no evidence of any lab leak that occurred at that site. In other words, nobody knew there. And, again, it was a relatively small scientific facility. So there was lots of friendly gossip going back and forth. People talked about what was going on. There's simply no evidence that any lab leak had occurred. Furthermore, there's absolutely no evidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was working on that type of virus. If they had been doing research on a COVID-like virus, there's no reason they wouldn't have published those results. There's simply no evidence that they were working on the virus. There is no evidence it leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And another question that's come up is, various Western sources have argued that the safety conditions at the Wuhan lab were insufficient, and that simply increased the likelihood of a lab leak occurring. Danielle Anderson, the Western virologist working there, said that's not a bit true. The safety conditions were absolutely outstanding when she was there. In fact, they were so good that she urged her colleagues back in Australia to adopt similar safety conditions modeled after the ones in the Wuhan lab. So we have a situation where there's very strong evidence, technical evidence, that the virus is artificial. In other words, it has the furin cleavage site, which is the sort of thing that would have been added in a laboratory. There's absolutely no evidence, despite efforts made, of finding any related natural virus anywhere in the city of Wuhan or anywhere else in China. There's no natural viral reservoir that could have produced that virus. But there's absolutely no evidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was working on such a virus or produced such a virus, let alone that there was any lab leak from Wuhan. So it's a very strange situation. In other words, you have two theories out there. One of them that the virus is natural, which is massively contradicted by the physical genetic evidence of the virus. In other words, the virus has characteristics of exactly the sort you would have expected to be produced in a laboratory. And on the other hand, you have absolutely no evidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was working on that virus, let alone that it might have leaked from that laboratory. So that seems a very contradictory thing. And in fact, if you read most of the articles or the papers written by the supporters of the natural virus theory, their entire focus is the impossibility of the virus having leaked from the laboratory of Wuhan. In other words, they pretty much tend to ignore the issue of whether the virus has genetic structures that are natural or artificial because they don't have a strong case. They focus entirely on the very strong evidence that the virus did not leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Then, on the other hand, if you look at the articles and papers written by the supporters of the artificial virus theory, their entire focus is on the genetic structure of the virus, which they claim is obviously artificial, obviously bioengineered, and based on American bioengineering technology. And they tend to ignore the evidence that there simply is no sign of, the virus having leaked from the laboratory of Wuhan. There's simply no evidence there. So we have two theories out there, the natural theory and the lab leak theory, both of which are massively contradicted by hard evidence and expert testimony. And they've been talking past each other for 3 years now. For nearly 3 years, going back 3 years, I've proposed a third theory, a theory that is simply so controversial that virtually nobody until the last few weeks has been willing to even discuss it. And that theory is that the virus was certainly bioengineered, as all the evidence indicates, but it did not leak from the Wuhan lab. And if the virus did not leak from the Wuhan lab, the question is, how did it suddenly appear in the city of Wuhan in China? Again, there's very strong evidence the virus was produced by American bioengineering technology. America, for 70 years, has had the world's largest and best funded biowarfare program. The only program in the world that there's very strong evidence has actually been used to inflict death and casualties during the Korean War. So we're talking about a situation where America was at the peak of an international confrontation with China, the rival global power, whose economy had surpassed America's in size back in 2014. So the country in the world America regarded with the greatest degree of hostility was China. And suddenly, a dangerous, mysterious virus appears in China shortly before Chinese Lunar New Year, a period of time when hundreds of millions of Chinese immediately travel around the country going home for the holidays. And if the Chinese had not detected the mysterious new virus when they did in the city of Wuhan, as early as they did, and imposed the largest clampdown, the largest quarantine in the history of the world to contain the virus and stamp it out, it would have spread throughout the entire country of China and destroyed the Chinese economy, wrecked, damaged the Chinese economy and society, and quite possibly inflicted extremely severe damage on Chinese political structure. So we're talking about a situation where the country in the world America's most hostile towards is suddenly hit with a mysterious virus at the peak of America's international confrontation with China. And that made me quite suspicious at the time, but there are a lot more facts that then started to come out. In fact, I published my first paper on the issue in April 2020, very early on, almost 3 years ago now. It turns out for 8 months prior to the appearance of the virus in the city of Wuhan, the virus, based on genetic and epidemiological evidence, it's pretty clear that the virus probably appeared in the city of Wuhan, with patient 0 having been first infected, probably in late October or sometime in November. In other words, that's basically when the virus appeared, though it wasn't detected for another month or two, since, again, it was an entirely new virus that nobody had contact with before. Now, it turns out America's leading biowarfare advocate since the late 1990s is a man named Dr. Robert Kadlec. Donald Trump brought him in to be head of biowarfare, biodefense in 2017. Then in 2018, China was hit with a mysterious viral epidemic that severely damaged its poultry industry. And in very early 2019, China was hit by another mysterious viral epidemic that devastated its pork industry. 40% of all the pigs in China had to be destroyed. Pork is China's leading meat source. And so we're talking about a situation where two mysterious viral epidemics suddenly inflicted severe blows on the Chinese economy right after America had put into office America's leading biowarfare advocate who'd advocated biowarfare as a very effective and plausibly deniable means of severely damaging an international adversary, with China being our leading international adversary. But there are fascinating details that then come into play. From January to August 2019, Cadillac ran something called the Crimson Contagion Exercise, in which federal and state authorities throughout the United States practiced their defensive drill against the danger of a dangerous respiratory virus such as COVID suddenly appearing in China and leaking into the United States. So America spent 8 months under the direction of its chief biowarfare advocate practicing defense against a COVID-like virus if it suddenly appeared in China. And a month or two later, exactly that sort of virus suddenly appeared in the city of Wuhan. Furthermore, when you look at, for example, the issue of how America reacted to the virus, it turns out the virus then spread around the world. One of the most shocking things which I noticed at the time is the country that then became the second epicenter of the viral epidemic after it got outside of China was not in East Asia. It was not a country with a large Chinese population. It was Iran, the other country America was most hostile towards. And the virus spread to the holy city of Qom in Iran, which is the center of Iran's political and religious elites, the ruling class of the country, and it infected that ruling class. It hit Iran before the virus had appeared almost anywhere else in the world outside of China. So we have a situation where the two countries in the world at that time, China and Iran, that America was most hostile towards, were the two countries first hit by this mysterious viral epidemic. And the Iranian leadership was hit by the virus just a few weeks after America had publicly assassinated Iran's top military commander. Not only that, but the Iranians publicly accused America of having launched a biowarfare attack against them. They complained to the United Nations because biowarfare is illegal. They complained that America had launched an illegal biowarfare attack against Iran. But none of that was ever reported in the American media, so that Americans, including myself, never heard about it at the time. So we have a situation where the two countries in the world America was most hostile towards, were the two countries first hit by the deadly COVID epidemic. And in fact, they specifically charged America with having engaged in biowarfare. There's a third example, which is the most shocking probably of all. And that's once the virus then started spreading back to the United States, the problem was America basically, and one thing I should say, there's absolutely no evidence that Donald Trump himself was involved in the biowarfare attack or was even aware of it. And in fact, the proof that he was innocent of any involvement is the fact that once the virus started spreading back to the United States, he totally ignored it. He dismissed it. He said, oh, it was just the flu and that nobody should pay any attention to it. As a result of the spread in the United States and the fact that America botched its defensive machinery against the viral spread, suddenly thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of Americans suddenly became infected, with many thousands of deaths appearing. At that point, America's national security establishment, our intelligence apparatus, became very embarrassed. In other words, they thought to themselves, my God, we're going to be blamed for having failed to defend America against this deadly epidemic, which is spreading and killing thousands of Americans. So it turns out they leaked to ABC News a secret Defense Intelligence Agency report describing the Wuhan epidemic and explaining that there was a dangerous viral epidemic, a massive epidemic taking place in the city of Wuhan, and urging the White House and America's top leadership to defend itself against any possible infection. That report came from 4 separate intelligence sources and was a big ABC News story. And in fact, at first, the Pentagon basically refused to respond to the report and had no comment. But then somebody noticed the dates. The report had been provided in November and described a massive, devastating viral epidemic taking place in the city of Wuhan. That was before there was an epidemic in the city of Wuhan. The virus had barely appeared at that time, and probably only a handful of people in a city of 11 million were starting to feel a little bit sick. Nobody in the world would have known of that viral epidemic taking place in the city of Wuhan, except for the people involved in spreading it. And that constitutes what might be regarded as the smoking gun of American guilt involved in launching a biowarfare attack against China and against Iran that then leaked back and devastated our own country, killing over 1 million Americans, over 1 million Europeans, and well over 15 million around the world. Now,
Brilliant exposition, Ron. Quite brilliant. I'm enjoying the conversation, but we don't have a lot of time. And
sure.
you have also been talking about the COVID-19 vaccine. So the Financial Times ran a report that said the vaccines alter neurological conditions. There was a study from Israel saying that the vaccines lower sperm quantity, but you have been quite critical of anti-vaxxers. Why?
Oh, right. I mean, I've looked into it a little bit, and there's simply no evidence that most of the accusations of the anti-vaxxers have any reality to them. In other words, when you look at it around the world, those countries that had the heaviest vaccination regime using the mRNA technology had relatively low COVID death rates. And the countries, for example, the main factor involved in COVID death rates around the world seems to be obesity. In other words, countries that have high obesity rates tend to have very high COVID death rates for their working age population rather than just the elderly population. And that's simply the pattern. In other words, there's absolutely no evidence, as far as I can tell, of the vaccines being dangerous in the way that most of the anti-vaxxers claim. And obviously, there are all of these anti-vaxxing theories floating around the internet that have become wildly popular in conspiratorial circles. And to be honest, I was skeptical of them from the beginning. But once I looked into the data, especially the international data, on the different countries that have suffered the most from the COVID epidemic, there's simply no evidence that the vaccines are anything like as dangerous as some of these people claim. No, the vaccines were not tested. They were not tested because the countries around the world were so desperate to release them. And so I'm sure they're far more dangerous than the annual flu shots most people have. But I mean, that's very different than the danger from the virus itself. In other words, COVID seems to have a death rate roughly, but the original COVID, roughly between 0.5% and 1%. So it's certainly not the sort of bioweapon that would exterminate a population, but we are still talking about millions of deaths. And there seems very good evidence that higher levels of vaccination tend to dramatically reduce those deaths. Now, the interesting thing about it is you could almost make a case that some of these conspiratorial theories regarding the vaccines may have been promoted to distract people from looking at the origins of the virus, which are obviously a matter far more concern to America's military defense establishment, which probably was implicated in the attack. So, in other words, when you have a situation where large numbers of conspiratorial-minded people are going on a wild goose chase, pursuing issues of vaccine concerns, that obviously makes it much less likely that people would focus on what I think is the real issue, where COVID came from, and whether indeed it was an American biowarfare attack that has inadvertently caused the deaths of over 1 million Americans. In other words, we're talking about something, the COVID epidemic is arguably the most important thing to happen in the world since the Second World War. It's killed over 1 million Americans, many times more Americans than have died in all of our recent wars combined. And I think there's very good evidence that it was the result, the blowback from a botched American biowarfare attack against China and against Iran. And if that story comes out, we're talking about probably the biggest story in modern times.
Great.
And obviously, the people involved are very, very interested in making sure it does not come out.
Well, Rana, I have written on COVID-19 and Germinal Van did a study, and there's another study from Europe arguing that COVID vaccines don't slow the spread of the disease. You don't have to respond. I'm just giving you my take, but vaccines have side effects. Medications usually have side effects. So arguing that the vaccine has a side effect is not necessarily a case against the vaccine, but based on the new research, the vaccines tend to have a high level of negative effects. That's what I have been seeing. You may differ. We already discussed it earlier. But before we end, I'm just going to talk briefly about Project Veritas, James O'Keefe. So James O'Keefe interviewed a Pfizer executive, and this is the title of an article online. Busted Pfizer R&D exec claims he lied about mutating COVID to impress a date like normal people. I'm just bringing this up because I don't take Project Veritas seriously. So even if the vaccine has a deleterious impact on people, I don't think we should use James O'Keefe and Project Veritas to implicate the vaccine.
Sure, the guy involved was a marketing executive. In other words, basically, marketing executives tend to lie about almost everything all the time. That's part of their job description. So, again, the vaccines certainly are much less safe than annual flu shots. And the question is simply, are the vaccines more safe than getting COVID? And, the whole thing is the current Omicron version of COVID is very mild. So, in other words, with Omicron now in circulation, it's not entirely clear whether the vaccines are as necessary as they were early on with the original strain of the virus and then with the Delta strain that was very dangerous. So, the point about it is at the time, I think the vaccine approach was certainly the more sensible thing for most people to take. Now, the whole thing is the vaccines are they're very so-so in their effectiveness. In other words, they're not very effective in preventing infection from the virus, and they're not very effective in preventing transmission of the virus. They simply reduce the severity of the symptoms of the vaccinated individual. So vaccine mandates never really made much sense since, to the extent that, for example, somebody could then still get infected and spread the virus to other people, there's no reason for the government to force vaccinations. And, individuals could make up their own mind. In other words, if somebody wants to basically weigh the risks of possibly suffering severe COVID symptoms against untested vaccine using an entirely new biotechnology, the mRNA technology, I mean, I think probably that's their own call on it. So I think the whole notion of the vaccine mandates was very misguided from the beginning.
They were. They were
There's also
misguided.
there's also no reason to vaccinate children, as far as I can see. There's really no evidence of that. So, I mean, the whole thing about it is those sort of issues are very different than the question of, basically the vaccine itself being safe or not safe. And I mean, the whole point about it is probably between 15 and 20 million people around the world have died from COVID. The COVID death rate early on was between 0.5 and 1%. For the elderly, it was sometimes 5, 10, even 15%. And so for those groups most vulnerable, I think it was a very sensible decision to be vaccinated. I mean, the whole thing about it is the death rate of people under 40 was probably 1/100th the death rate of people over 60. And so the vaccine sensibly should have been aimed certainly at the more elderly population. But on the other hand, the claims made by these anti-vaxxers that the vaccine sterilizes people, that it kills a huge number of people, that it causes huge numbers of heart attacks or strokes. I mean, there's really just very little evidence for that. And it was only really in the last few weeks I spent some time looking into it. So, from my point of view, I think this whole anti-vaxxing debate, which has probably received 100 or even 1,000 times as much attention as the origins of COVID itself, is entirely distraction and very possibly a deliberate distraction put out there to simply draw people away from the question they should be asking is, did an illegal American biowarfare attack kill 1 million American citizens? And if that answer ends up being yes, I think we're talking about very dramatic happening in the United States.
Thanks for coming to the show, Ron. I'm sure that my listeners greatly appreciate your insights. You're quite a brilliant and eloquent man, but unfortunately, we can't speak for 1 hour, 2 hours today. But thanks again, and I have your email, so we'll continue to correspond via email. Bye.
Hey, thanks a lot.